Look, the idea that the United States can go around the world violating the sovereignty of other countries, invading those countries, and doing social engineering at the end of a rifle barrel is a prescription for giant trouble. If you're smart, you stay out of countries like Iraq. You stay out of countries like Afghanistan. When I was young, right, I was in the American military. I was in the American military from 1965 to 1975, which was coterminous with the Vietnam War. And over the course of those 10 years, I watched the United States get battered in Vietnam and lose. We lost the Vietnam War. It was a deeply humbling experience for the American people. And the thing I learned was you do not want to go into a place like Vietnam. It's a prescription for real trouble. The French were there before us. Remember, the French were defeated at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. De Gaulle told us in 1964 and 1965, don't go in there. We've been there, done that. It did not turn out well. It's not going to turn out well for you. It did not turn out well for us. And then I remember in 1979, the Chinese foolishly invaded North Vietnam, or it was then Vietnam, but the northern part of Vietnam, and they got their snouts whacked. In 1979, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. Most of my colleagues, if not all my colleagues in the national security community, were aghast. Soviets are on the march. This is the end of the world. We have to double the defense budget. We have to do this. We have to do that. I said, you're dead wrong. They just jumped into a giant quagmire. If you're arms racing with the Soviet Union, what you want them to do is try and invade a country like Afghanistan. You saw what happened to us. We're still there 14 years later. Or what, 14 years later, 18 years later, right? It's the longest war in American history. Stay out of these places. People in countries like Iraq, countries like Afghanistan, and other countries around the world do not want the United States invading them and telling them how to do their politics. And what happens is we become an occupier, and that leads to an insurgency, and it is one giant mess. So you want to stay out. The point is you get resistance. And by the way, the power of nationalism also applies to the Russians and the Chinese. You know that the United States is interested in foisting liberal democracy on Moscow and on Beijing. There's no question about that. You go to Moscow and you go to Beijing and you talk to the foreign policy elites about how they think about it. They think about it the same way we think about the Russians interfering in our domestic politics. Surprise, surprise. As my mother taught me when I was a little boy, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. No? So, if we don't like the Russians interfering in our politics, don't be surprised if they don't like us interfering in their politics. And the same thing goes with the Chinese. That's the power of nationalism. You want to remember this as time goes by. Going into other countries and doing social engineering, you're asking for big trouble. Power of realism. Let me go to my NATO example. It's my favorite example here. The idea that you could take NATO, which was a mortal enemy of the Soviet Union, which was the predecessor of Russia, right? Russia's the largest remnant state out of the Soviet Union. It sort of inherited the mantle of the Soviet Union. The idea that you could take NATO and march it right up to Russia's doorstep and Russia's going to do nothing is lunacy. It's just lunacy. Just to take the American case, the Americans have what's called the Monroe Doctrine. The Americans basically say, I know many of you are not going to like hearing this, but it's true. This is what the Americans basically say. We own the Western Hemisphere. It's our backyard. No distant great power from Europe or from Asia is either allowed to form a military alliance with a country in the Western Hemisphere or bring military forces into the Western Hemisphere. When I was young, we had this thing called the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviets put missiles in Cuba. This is categorically unacceptable to the United States. And we told the Soviets that, and we forced them to take the nuclear missiles out. Then they talked about building a naval base at Cienfuegos in Cuba. The United States again told them, this is categorically unacceptable. This is the Monroe Doctrine. You do not bring Soviet military forces into the Western Hemisphere. Let me give you a hypothetical situation. 50 years from now, China's really powerful. It forms a military alliance with Canada and with Mexico. It starts to move troops into Toronto and Mexico City. You think the Americans are just going to sit there? The Chinese ambassador to the United States and the Mexican ambassador to the United States go to the president and they say, you don't have anything to worry about. We're a benign hegemon, right? This is not aimed at you. What do you think the president's going to believe that? You think we're going to tolerate Chinese military forces in Canada or in Mexico? I can assure you we are not. Well, the Russians are the same as the Americans in this regard. They do not want Ukraine and Georgia turned into Western bulwarks. Very simple. By the way, Syria, you understand what happened in Syria. In 2011, when Assad's in trouble, the Americans, the Turks, the Saudis, the Qataris begin to move in, and they begin to fund the insurgents, and they begin to fuel the insurgency, and they begin to try to topple Assad. By 2015, it looks like Assad is going under. What happens? The Russians come in. The Russians have a long-standing alliance with Syria. The Russians have a naval base in Syria. Surprise of surprises. The Russians decide they're going to prop up Assad. That's Realpolitik 101. And who succeeded? The Russians succeeded. And the Americans lost. Assad is going to remain in power. Overselling of individual rights. Final point here. Look, I think if you go around the world, there is a great deal of interest in individual rights almost everywhere. People care about rights, and I don't want to make light of that. But they don't care that much about rights in a lot of places. And they don't care that much about liberal democracy. Liberal democracy is not an easy sell in a lot of places. Go to Russia and say to your average well-educated Russian, or somebody even in the Russian foreign policy elite, what you need is liberal democracy. They'll look at you like you're nuts. And they'll say, we tried liberal democracy in the 1990s. It was the Wild West. We do not want to return to the 1990s. We don't need liberal democracy, thank you. And we'll take Putin and his soft authoritarianism, despite its problems, every time over liberal democracy. So what this tells you is you're not selling an ideology or a political governing system that is that wildly attractive in all places. It's oftentimes a hard sell. And when you go into a country and you topple the regime and there's chaos all around you, people are mainly interested in security, not individual rights. Okay, liberal hegemony's future, and I'll conclude here. My argument is that liberal hegemony is finished. And there are two reasons. The first, which is the least important reason, is Donald Trump. Donald Trump ran against liberal hegemony. Just think about it. He said that I am no longer interested in having the United States try to spread democracy around the world. And as you know, Donald Trump has never seen an autocrat or dictator that he didn't want to jump into bed with. He has no special place in his heart for liberal democracies, right? And he's not interested in spreading liberal democracy all over the planet. Second, with regard to the open international order, he's a protectionist. He thinks that America has been screwed by the open international economy. He wants to slap tariffs not only on countries like China, but on our allies as well. And with regard to institutions, the guy's never seen an institution that he didn't love. He hates NATO, he hates the EU, he hates NAFTA, he hates the IMF, God, he hates the WTO, he hates the World Bank. One of the first things he did when he took office was to kill the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was actually a boneheaded move, but nevertheless it reflects the fact that he hates institutions. You want to know why the foreign policy establishment in the United States loathes Donald Trump? It's because he ran against everything they stand for. But he got elected. And you know why he got elected? Because he pointed out that the policy has been a failure. So we have this disconnect between the elites who want to perpetrate forever and ever this foreign policy and the body politic. And by the way, Trump's not an exception here. Barack Obama was elected in 2008 on the platform that we were going to get out of the business of nation building, and Obama, to use his own words, said we should do nation building at home. And then right before he left office, he gave a very famous interview with Jeffrey Goldberg of the Atlantic Monthly, where he basically said that the foreign policy establishment, what we sometimes call the blob in the United States, the blob beat him back. And he was forced to play, in his words, by the Washington playbook. But Obama was not that different than Trump in certain respects, with regard to foreign policy, right? But Trump is not being beaten back. But more importantly, liberal hegemony is over because of the rise of China and the resurrection of Russian power. As I said to you earlier, and it's very important you understand this point, you can only have liberal hegemony. You can only pursue this really radical foreign policy in a unipolar world where the sole pole, which is of course Uncle Sam, does not have to worry about competing with other great powers. Now that China and Russia are considered great powers, and we're talking about the return of great power politics, and we're talking about multipolarity, security competition is back in force, and it squeezes out liberal hegemony. So, for better or for worse, liberal hegemony is history. Thank you.